that needs to be considered for accurate interpretation. Now, he doesn't get into the specifics of what that standard would be. He simply mentions that some of the things that we would consider significant may just be more observing a standard at the time. And I'm just thinking, sitting here listening to this, without, completely discounting the idea, because it certainly is intriguing.
Well, Reverend Darlinson actually uses contemporary astrological references to make his correlations. So he's reading Ptolemy, and he's reading, I think it's Marcellus or Mariellus, I don't know, I'd have to take a look at it, but definitely he's using contemporary sources, astrological sources, to draw his correlations. So when he's talking about, the Aries relates to the head, this would be common knowledge among the learned classes of Greek society. And you've got to understand, Alexandria, although this was probably written by a very devout Jew, because there's definitely references to Psalms, he's definitely a Greek Jew. And so he would know, if he's a learned Greek Jew, he would know about astrology, he would know about these correlations, simply because of the fact of where he lives and the environment that he works in. So yes, he's using a common language that is very common not only to the learned people in his area, but the learned people throughout the known world.
Back to another idea by Bishop Spong. I've forgotten the book, but one of his works he mentions that postulates that the Gospels were written not as a record of historical things that happened in order, but actually as sort of a lectionary for the Jewish liturgical year. And I was wondering if there's any overlap between that idea and the signs of the Zodiac.
I'm almost certain that Bill Darlinson read the same book, because he does make reference to the fact that this is an overlap with the Jewish zodiacal year, and that a lot of the words that are used and a lot of the imagery that's used is specifically in a Jewish context, although some of it is definitely also Greek.
Pursuant to that point, there's a book called The Astrological Wisdom of the Hebrew Sages by Rabbi Joel C. Dobin, which goes into Talmudic and I believe even earlier, specifically astrological uses of the system, which could give a lot of detail.
So I think this is an interesting topic, and like I say, I have just scratched the surface of it. There's definitely tie-ins across the ancient world with all of these ideas. So the environment that this is, we always think of this as being written in an environment where the person is living in a Christian community, but more than likely he's living in a very polyglot sort of community where he's got Greeks, he's got Jews, he's got, Christians, and they're all talking to each other. And in the process of this, there's a lot of cross-pollination over the symbolisms that are being used. And especially if he's writing this as a gospel, as a tract, to try and bring people to his point of view, he's going to use the imagery that the learned classes know. And the imagery they know, the Greek zodiac, the mythology, he's going to use those symbols and bring it in there. And another thing that is pointed out is that he makes jokes. He makes a lot of puns and plays on words that are lost in the translation. Like the woman on the rock, Peter's mother-in-law. It's a pun in Greek. So it's a very interesting sort of thing. It's definitely the work of a very learned person.
Is there a one-to-one correspondence between the Hebrew zodiac and the zodiac that we're familiar with?
Yes,
Okay.
with the exception of Libra, I think. I think Libra is a later addition. The Hebrew zodiac comes out of the Babylonian zodiac, and Hebrew zodiac comes out of the Babylonian. The Babylonians didn't have Libra. That was a later Greek-Roman addition, if I'm not mistaken. And they kind of separated out Sagittarius and Scorpio.
Right.
So, or Scorpio and Virgo. I don't know. Yeah, Scorpio and Virgo, because Libra's in between. So that's pretty much what I have prepared. I don't know if there are more questions, or if you want me to try and go through another sign to show the correspondences. I can do that too.
I'm curious, you mentioned some of the criticism that the concept has faced. I was wondering if you could maybe enlighten us a little more to some of the more common arguments detracting this theory.
Well, first of all, there's Irenaeus himself, back in the day, who wrote a very big tract against it, saying, no, this is a historical document. This is not supposed to be read as some sort of initiatory, magical sort of tract or guideline or guidepost. It is, most definitely a record of the events, even if the events are not in order. And that's a point that either he makes or a later scholar makes. More recently, one of the criticisms I've seen of this book in particular is that, quote, it's just a retread of the solar cycle myth, unquote. You know, there's a very big, or there has been a trend throughout Christianity to try and tie Jesus the Son with solar the sun. And they make a lot of correspondences like this, and the argument of most Orthodox, not Orthodox, but mainstream Christian scholars is that they're stretching. They're really reaching and stretching the evidence to fit where it doesn't necessarily. And I have to admit, I can see a little of that, especially in this book. He's making correspondences very fast, very loose, and not necessarily very well. His correspondences to the actual sign are limited. His correspondences to the decans are very strong or are made to fit. Especially in some of the other signs in the middle of the year when you're talking about Capricorn and the governance that Capricorn is supposed to be about. Capricorn is not the individual but the community and the group and the strictures that the community puts on things. He makes a lot of references to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in that section and how they're, you know, made to look like fools by Jesus. But he doesn't necessarily tie it into any of the decans at all. There's no decan points at any point in this gospel, whereas in Aries he relies on the decans to sort of make part of his argument.
Being a practical Virgo, does he go beyond this to go into detail as to how this might have been used? If it was written to be tied into these processes that the soul went through, does he think that these were exercises or meditations or path workings, or does he touch upon any conjecture as to how this might have been used?
None. If this is actually an initiatory document, it would have been an oral initiation, and we've lost it.
And there could also be some parallels to the Jewish liturgical practice, just looking at the holidays. And does he talk about the Jewish calendrics at all?
No, not so much. He focuses mostly on the Greek because he has easily accessible Greek astrological sources. And I don't know that he looked at the Hebrew astrological sources as deeply.
The curiosity here as well is that given when Mark was written, or allegedly written, you wouldn't have seen more or less, and I don't like to use the word schism, I don't know what the word to use, and somebody please fill it in for me. When you see the beginning of Christianity moving away from Jewish temple tradition. A lot of people say that it was based on just the destruction of the temple kind of thing, and I think the process was probably already in flow when the temple happened. It just was more or less fodder for, a greater issue. The funny thing but within the reading that I've done, it's more or less acknowledged that Mark is an attempt where Christianity doesn't yet really truly exist at this point in time, unlike the other Gospels, and that he is writing, or whoever has written it as a Jew. But that being said, I mean, isn't this, I guess what I'm stuck with is just the thought that so far, based on just what we've talked about and assuming what you've said in terms of the criticism, that this is all wishful thinking on this guy's part. It's just sort of, I think this is the way it is. What would be the purpose of Christianity as a separate entity actually doing this?
But see, here's the point. You're thinking of Christianity as a monolithic entity, and it's not, as we prove just by our very existence. So there are different branches. There are people who are interested in astrology, they're interested in the myth of Jesus, and they want to tie the two of them together. There are always people who are syncretic and want to make things make sense together. There are people who want to popularize it, and because they want to popularize it, they want to use the language that other people know. Their friends all know astrology. Why not bring the myth into astrology and say, hey, this is a very interesting idea. Masonry does it all the time. It takes Masonic symbols and puts them into a different framework to say, hey, this stuff has Masonic associations.
Well,
Sean?
I would just add that, I don't think it's unlikely that, communities or groups would want to use this or tie this in. I mean, to say, well, why would they just want to adopt this kind of mythological thing and tie it into what they understand as their history? But I mean, it's just as simple as, our reaction to that, might be not too different from the from the Jewish communities that were freaked out when some other communities went with a high Christology. There's no difference, in terms of they're tying it into something, bigger and higher. And to comment on